Mastering Jira reports, the Burndown chart. In this video, we're going to look at the Burndown chart that allows you to track your estimated work remaining versus the work completed and judge if you're on track to meet your sprint goals. Now, this is a report that applies only to Scrum boards, and note I say boards here. You can have a Kanban project set up with a Scrum board, and we'll look at that at the end. But you need to create a Scrum board, and from that board you can then look at the Burndown chart and report. And this chart can be used in 4 different ways. We can use it to track based on story points, original time estimate, estimated time remaining, and issue count. And I'm going to show you how to configure for each of these 4 different setups, and we're going to look at how all of the different elements in Jira interact in order to represent that estimated and actual work on the Burndown chart. So throughout this video, I'm going to have 4 tabs open in a browser because there are 4 different areas of Jira that interact to go together to make up what's displayed on the Burndown reports. So we'll have a look at the configuration for the board itself. There are some specific points in here that you need to be aware of. We'll be using the actual active sprint board to change the status of some of the issues and see how that's tracked on the board. And we'll be using the backlog and some of the data that's on the backlog that's relevant to this Burndown chart, and then of course the report itself. But before we get into this and we start looking at this first scenario with story points, there's a few configuration things you need to be aware of. The first configuration item you need to be aware of is that in calculating what's still to be completed and what has been completed, Jira tracks this in many of the scenarios based on the status value of the issues and the category of those statuses. So if you look at this workflow, we've got a number of different statuses: open, resolved, closed, etc. And they have different categories. There is a to-do category, there is a doing category, which is blue, and then there is the done category, which is color-coded in green. And these categories are probably already pre-configured in your setup. You'll see all the status values and they're associated with these categories: to do, in progress, and the done, which is the green one. When you transition an issue to a done status, i.e. it's in the done category and it is the green statuses here, it's only then in many of the reports that you will see this completed unit of work updated here. So this represents completed, this represents what's in progress, which is those blue statuses, and this represents what is to do or not started yet. So it's that transition to a done status that flips from tracking work that is still to be done and is then marked as done and shows up as a Burndown on the Burndown chart. Okay, so that's the first configuration element you need to be aware of. The second one is on the actual board configurations themselves. So we'll create a board in a minute, but the configuration items in these boards that are important: A is where the board is set up with the filter to pull data out of a project in Jira. So this filter query here is going to influence what is shown on the Burndown chart. So if you had this set to filter query project equals ATC and issue types equals story, then you will only see story issue types represented on the Burndown chart. The third configuration item you really need to be aware of is the custom field context. So at the moment I have issue types of story set up so that their context allows you to add a estimate of story points or estimated time, etc. on the issue type itself. But you may have yours configured so that in some instances you can't enter estimates against certain issue types. Okay, so if you cannot edit the estimates against an issue type of task or a bug, there is a setting in Jira under the issues. So settings, issues, fields, custom fields, and then there is the context for a particular field. Under story story points, and that context setting is what allows you to set whether or not an issue type allows you to track story points against it. So if you create, edit and change these contexts, if you don't want to track story points against bug issue types, for example, edit the context and you can remove and set the issue types that have the context that allows you to enter estimates against the issue type. Okay. The fourth and final thing to be aware of is that in Jira, in the different types of projects, so we have a company managed project and we have team managed projects. Company managed and team managed track story point estimates in different fields. So in this example, I have a company managed project, and you'll see here I am displaying two different story point estimate fields. Okay. Story points applies to company managed projects. Story point estimate applies to team managed projects. All right, so story point estimate, team managed projects. Story points applies to company managed. If you are showing story point estimates on a company managed project, this will not have any effect on your Burndown chart or your tracking of estimates versus actual work. So you will want to modify your configuration on your company managed projects to remove story point estimates. Okay. So I have removed story point estimate because company managed projects use the story points field. Okay, so bear that in mind. If your reports are not showing your completed work, it may be because you're using the wrong field for the wrong project type. So that's the 4 configuration items you need to concern yourself with. Next up then, let's have a look at actually tracking estimated versus actual effort based on story points and the Burndown chart with that configuration. First then, let's have a look at the Burndown chart and story points. Before you can create a Burndown report, you need a Scrum board and you need an active sprint. So what I'm going to do is set up a sprint 3. I've got some stories in there, I've got some bugs and I've got some tasks, and I can allocate, before I start the sprint, the estimated story points against various issues that I'm going to include in this sprint. So I can either edit these estimates in story points on the backlog values here, or I can drill into the issues themselves and I can add the story point estimates specifically on the record themselves. So this is the first part to getting this up and running, is I need an active sprint. So I start my sprint, and for the purpose of this I'm going to use a sprint that lasts just a few hours, and you'll see the reason for this when we look at the Burndown chart. It will give us more granularity. So we start the sprint, and now I've got an active sprint. I need to create a board that will filter the data I need to show in this Burndown report. So just for the sake of this, I already have a board here, but I'm going to create a new board. I'll create a board. It has to be a Scrum board for us to get in the report section, the Burndown report. I'm going to create the board from the existing project, and the board name will be ATC Sprint 3 board. The project is ATC, and the location for this board will be in this project itself. I create the board, and then I need to configure some of the settings in this board to reflect what I want to see on the Burndown chart in a minute. So if we look at the board configuration, the configuration items that will influence what's shown on the Burndown chart are obviously the project that we're working within and that filter query behind that project. So at the moment, this will show on the Burndown chart everything in this sprint that is filtered by this query, which at the moment just stands at the project. If I wanted my Burndown chart to only focus on stories and not bugs and not tasks, then I would edit that filter query and I would change it and save it so that it said and issue type equals story. And if I was to save that, then this filter query that dictates what's on the board will then dictate that only story issue types are displayed and calculated for the purpose of the Burndown chart. I'm going to stick with this for now though, just with all of the issue types, but just be aware that this filter query does have bearing on what's shown on the Burndown chart. The next configuration item you want to concern yourself with is the columns. So the columns and the statuses, as we spoke about just now, the done, the in progress and to do statuses and the mapping of these, it is when you have issues in the to do and in progress columns that are of to do or doing issue categories that the issues estimate in story points will be considered as work not yet done. The moment you transition an issue into this column, the done column, where you have these issue statuses of done category, then it will be used to calculate what's displayed on the Burndown chart. All right. So setting this up correctly is important too. The third item you want to concern yourself then with is the estimation settings on here. And this is where you decide whether you're going to use story points, original time estimate, issue count, and the estimated time remaining, which we'll talk about in a minute. For now, we want to go with story points. So this is set correctly, and that's our board configuration set up correctly. We have the board itself, which we can select from here, that shows the board and the status of all of the issues in this particular sprint. And you may want to configure in the board configuration under the card layout, you may want to add in here the story point field so that it shows up on the card itself. And remember, you've got to go with story points if it's a company managed project, story point estimate if it's a team managed. So I'll go with story point, save that, and that will give us on the board, that's what gives us this story point estimate shown on the card itself on the board. That's the board. The backlog then, so we have started our sprint, ATC Sprint 3, and you can see here at the moment, as we haven't actually completed any of the work items in the sprint, that we have the not started story points calculated at 16 story points, in progress 0 and completed at 0. One item worth mentioning here is that subtasks associated with any of your work items in a sprint are not used as part of the calculation for the Burndown chart. So if I add story points in here against the subtask or multiple subtasks, when I complete this story, these 6 story points will not be represented on the Burndown chart. And you can see that they're not represented in the calculation at the top on this backlog sprint view either. Right, so you can use them as an indication, but they're not used in any of the reporting in Jira. It is the actual story points against the standard issue types, stories, bugs, tasks, that is used in all of these calculations. Another point bearing in mind is that when you start to assign people to these stories, you'll see that we have this workload by assignee. Any of the values you've put against subtasks in here will be reflected in the workload by assignee chart that's displayed here. So at this point then, we've started the sprint, we've created the board, will now be used when we come to the Burndown report. So when we select that Burndown chart, it's that estimate of story points at the point where we started our sprint that is used as this initial sprint start story point estimate. So we're starting at 16, we've got this fairly crude 16 story points that we're burning down in a linear fashion to the end of the sprint. Below the burn down chart then is a list of all of the activities that will have any impact or influence on the data that's shown in this burn down chart. So you can see here that I changed the scope during the sprint of this issue ATC 36 and added 4 story points, and that is why this particular estimate has gone up in the sprint. So we're now sitting at a story point estimate of 20. And of course, as I update the status of issues within the sprint, either on the backlog view, if I move this to done, so it's going to this done status that will then use this story point 3 estimate and calculate as work actually completed, or when I transition an item from the to do to the done status in the columns on the actual board itself, those transitions to those done statuses are what will affect and influence what's displayed on the burn down chart. Again, every action that has an influence on the data that's displayed in that chart is tracked in this table below here. So I've just completed those 2 issues. They've transitioned to a done status, and we've decremented the story points from 20 down to 14 so far. And of course, if you change the status back to in progress or to do, then that will be reflected on the burn down chart as well. The tricky thing with this is that all of this is tracked and you cannot change or modify those transitions, and that will always be reflected on the burn down chart from here on in. So that's all you need to know about the story points and how tracking estimated and actual completion of work is reflected on the burn down chart. Let's have a look at original time estimate next then. So original time estimate and estimated time remaining, both of these are calculated based on 2 or 3 key time tracking fields in your Jira issues. And what's important here is the values down here. So on all of our issues, we have 3 values relating to time that we can enter. We can enter time spent, the time remaining, and the original estimate value. So those 3 values. When we look at the burn down chart with the original estimate time, we're going to use that field and only that field. And then in a minute, I'm going to show you how to use the estimated time remaining field. But what I would suggest is when you go for original time estimate is that you actually configure your projects so that you do not display the time tracking here, because it is likely to confuse people. All right. So when you set up your board under the estimation area, that you want to use original time estimate. And when you set that to original time estimate and you look at your backlog, you will see now when you refresh this that these figures here are now based on the original time estimate and not the story points. And down in this column as well, those original time estimates. Now, typically you'd set those before you start the sprint, but just for the purpose of the list, let's set this to 4 hours. Let's set this one to 6 hours, and we'll put a few more in there. 2 hours. And we'll do one more in here for 2 hours as well. So this is the original estimate field here. And again, you can set it either in this column here, or you can go into the issue in its entirety and update it on the original estimate field. Right, so these figures are now being used for the estimated time to completion, and when you transition an issue from a to-do to a done status, it will then be used to calculate the burn down figure. So if we go back to our reports area and look at the burn down chart and refresh that, we need to make sure we're in our active sprint, and you'll see this now defaults to original time estimate. And because I was updating the time estimate during the sprint, you can now see that the remaining value is now set at 11 hours. Right. Now, if I'd set those values before I started the sprint, then I would have the guideline down here, but I've set them during the sprint, so the guidelines showing that it started at 0 here. But again, everything is very similar to the story points. Everything you change is tracked here, but it's now based on those hours in the estimates. So if I come in here and I complete a task that has the original estimate against it, so this is 2 hours, and I come back in and refresh the Burndown chart, I should see that this Burndown chart is now showing that 2 hours of work has been completed in the Burndown. Right. So it's one figure, the original estimate, and it's the transition from a to-do or doing to a done state that is then reflected on the Burndown chart. So again, very similar to story points in the way it operates. It's just that the unit of measure is now minutes, hours and days, and you estimate the value at the start, and that value is used to increment the completed value when you move the issue to done status. So let's have a look at estimated time remaining next. And the estimated time remaining is where things start to get a little bit more complex. So what comes into play now is not this original estimate value, that's now ignored. What we'll be using is this time tracking element within your Jira issues. So we can track the time spent and the time remaining. But before we start updating those values, we need to update the settings on our board itself, and we need to change this and make sure it is set to original time estimate again, but we put the time tracking on. And it's this button here, or this slider, that now brings into play these time tracking values that include both time spent and the estimated time remaining. So the estimated time remaining is actually picked up from the original estimate, although original estimate is not used in the Burndown chart. This original estimate value is what sets the time remaining initial value. Okay, so if I was to change this now to 4 hours, it would actually update this to 4 hours for the time remaining. So the two are slightly linked, but it's this value that's used in the Burndown, not the original estimate. But here, as a developer, tester, whatever that's working on this issue, I can put in here that I've spent 2 hours. It automatically calculates that time remaining as 2 hours. But again, I can now update that as the person working on this ticket, and I can change that so that I've got 2 hours logged against it and 3 hours remaining. Of course, this is all tracked in the work log here, but it's these two values that are now used in the Burndown chart, not the transition into a done status. That transition into a done status is now ignored, and it's those two values that are used in the Burndown report. Because now our original estimate was that 4 hours, but when we look at the issue itself, we've got 2 hours logged, 3 hours remaining, and in our report we'll now see that we have the option to select time remaining estimate. So this is picking up from those two values, and if you see here, I'm on estimated remaining time of about 15 hours, and if I update this and say my estimated remaining time is actually 5 hours now, you'll see those 2 hours added to my Burndown chart. Okay, and equally, if I move in here and I change that now to 5 hours spent, you'll see that I've got 7 hours logged. There's no remaining time left, and that will be reflected in the Burndown chart again, so that we will see those 7 hours reflected on the Burndown chart. So it's not the status of the issue that's influencing this, it is the actual and estimated time that's tracked against the issue. So marking this issue as done has no influence whatsoever on that Burndown chart in this particular setup. So don't forget to get this working with the actual and estimated time you're tracking. It's a slightly strange configuration setup. You need to select estimation time, original time here, turn on time tracking, and it's that, or those two settings together in conjunction, that give you the remaining time estimate, which uses the time spent and the time remaining values to calculate on your Burndown chart. So the last one we've got to look at then is issue count, which we'll look at next. Issue count then, very similar to story points, simplest of all of them. If we look at our Jira setup, we go to the board again, we need to go to the estimation, we need to set this to issue count, and I'll remove the time tracking from there because we're basing this on issue count now. And when we look at our backlog and refresh this view, what we'll see top right here is that these calculations are now based on the number of issues. So I have 3 issues that are in a to-do state, 1 in a doing, and 3 in a done state. And when we come to the actual Burndown chart itself, refresh this, this will now default to issue count, and you can see a very straightforward, crude number of issues to work on. The Burndown guideline showing us completion of all 7 issues at the end of the sprint, and each time I transition an issue from one status to another, it's used to calculate and display the Burndown rate on the chart itself. Again, it's that transition from a doing state to a done state, which is considered that will dictate when the Burndown chart is updated. Okay, so it's that transition. You should see that reflected in the Burndown chart now. Bear in mind that any sub-issues that are added to the standard issue types are not used as part of that calculation. It's a straight standard issue types, where the standard issue type might be story, bug, task, etc. that's used in this calculation. And that's it, the 4 ways you can use the Burndown chart. And don't forget that it all depends on the board that you configure as to which of these approaches you can use on the Burndown chart. And it's totally valid to have one project with different boards, where different boards are configured to show story point estimates, and maybe another board is configured in the same project to show estimated time remaining. That's totally valid setup, and maybe different people want different views of that same data in the same project. The final last confusing thing to leave you with is that whilst a Burndown chart is specifically for Scrum, you can set up a Kanban project in Jira, and that Kanban project can then have a Scrum board. And so long as the board is set up and configured as a Scrum board, when you create the board, even though it's within a Kanban project or project template when you created the project, if that is a Scrum board, you will have access to the Burndown chart in a Scrum project. And maybe there's a particular small element of your Kanban project that is time boxed with a sprint, so you can create that board and backlog and a sprint in that Kanban project. And it's worth mentioning that if you have a Kanban board in a Scrum project or a Kanban board in the Kanban project, that board and selecting that Kanban board, when you then go to the reports, is why you will not see the Burndown chart in there, because we've got a Kanban board that is overlaying your project and all of your work within that project, and it's the Kanban board that dictates what type of reports that you will see in a Kanban board. Whereas you get a different set of reports when you're viewing a Scrum board, and the relevant reports for Scrum include the Burndown chart. So in the next video, we're going to have a look at the burn up chart. But for now, just remember that the Burndown chart is created from a Scrum board, and you can configure that Scrum board so that you have either story points, original time estimate, estimated time remaining, or issue counts displayed on those burn down reports.